everyone. It is truly packed, and I am really excited to be here to talk about what is one of my favorite topics when we talk about small business, how we get money, how we find money. And this is going to be a great panel. Pia, I wanted to actually start with you.
Okay.
So small business ownership is kind of a big career shift for you. You were in politics before this. Can you talk to me first about what precipitated that shift, and then where you found the money to do this? How did you fund your venture?
Sure. So I was working on the Hill for a wonderful congresswoman named Gabby Giffords from Tucson, Arizona, in early January 2011. Obviously, she was shot, and all of our lives changed in a pretty drastic way. For me, I was in D.C. that day, so uninjured, unlike a lot of other people. But it did impact me to the point that sort of you take stock of your life, the decisions you've made, what's important in your priorities, and my sort of childhood best friend, the person that for me was mostly a sibling, we had been talking about this for a long, long time. And that was the moment that sort of began the momentum for us to take it to the next step. This business took years to open. We opened in May of this year, but had really for 4 years had been in active planning. Our capital came from a number of different places. We did a crowdfunding campaign, as Margaret mentioned. We were the largest in the world of the PERC crowdfunding style. We also raised traditional equity from friends, family, professional contacts, and then last we had a small business loan from Eagle Bank here in the region, and we're again now raising money through the equity crowdfunding campaign opportunities that are brand new and available to businesses like us. So exciting time.
Yeah. Harold, so I want to ask you, we just heard all of the different ways that Pia was able to raise money, all the different sources she went to. What do you think are some of the biggest obstacles that new small business owners face when they are trying to raise capital?
Some of the biggest obstacles, there's a couple. One I think is certainly looking at the ecosystem and the area that a person may be looking to start a business. DC isn't necessarily the easiest of places, in part because it's situated within the region. So depending on where you're looking to do business, that'll determine some of the regulatory environment, some of the opportunities for capital, even opportunities for assistance. Second, of course, I would say, which is the purpose of the panel, obviously capital. And knowing what sources of capital are actually available and how you can access them is certainly key. One of the things that we focus on is actually doing a little bit of both. We're just not concerned about getting capital in your hands, but also knowing that not only the financial health of your business, how you're positioned, but ultimately how the business owner how their financial capability is actually increased, so they know the types of capital they need. It might not be with my organization. It might be with an Eagle Bank or an industrial bank, or it might be that there's venture opportunities that are out there. So for us, it's really investing in the person and making sure that they know what opportunities are available for them. But one of the challenges there is certainly knowledge and knowing what those options are. And frankly, in this region, depending on the type of entrepreneur, having the collateral as well. So I know we noted friends and family a little earlier, but we're in a region that has a very stark contrast, and people who do actually have access to collateral, be it friends, family, those sort of resources, and those who don't. So when you think about some of the structural barriers that are there, they're pretty stark to accessing traditional capital.
Yeah, I want to come back to you for 1 second. I want to talk specifically about your crowdfunding venture and Indiegogo. What gave you guys the idea to do that? How did you go about it? And what was your experience raising money that way?
So I had met some of the founders of Indiegogo a couple of years ago, and understood that the community building nature of crowdfunding could be a real catalyst to a business like ours, especially one that has a brick and mortar presence and that is in a sort of an interesting neighborhood, even in DC, a place that people really aren't even coming to regularly. We felt it was important, and we approached it, I guess, the way that we approach everything, which is if we're going to do it, we're going to try to do it as best as possible. So, we put together a great video. We explained the business in the most clear possible manner, and it was ended up being very successful. And I think the surprising thing for us was how important that success was to future funds. I really just underestimated the impact that was going to have on convincing more traditional investors and, of course, banks that we were a viable business. So, yeah.
Karen, I want to bring you in here. I know in the past you've talked a few times about some of the regulatory burdens that small businesses face, and now we've seen some changes to Title III and crowdfunding rules. I want to hear your take on that and what you think that does for small business owners.
Well, I think it's going to be great news moving ahead. The Jobs Act was passed and made equity and debt-based crowdfunding legal 4 years ago, but it took the SEC several years actually to move forward with the regulation. So it's only been since May of 2016 that Title III crowdfunding went live. And some people are like, well, should we be disappointed, that it didn't really just take off like a rocket? But I think it's doing, quite well, given that, again, May of 2016 it went live. There's about 160 companies that have filed with the SEC. There is about close to 100 million in terms of the demand for capital from those companies. And there's been a lot of successful fundraisers. So it's going to be really terrific moving forward. And I think the other good thing is that with regard to Title III crowdfunding and crowdfunding in general, there's also bipartisan support in the Congress to make some changes to the original Jobs Act to make it a more viable platform for small businesses. For example, increasing the amount that you raise from 1 million to 5 million. Allowing entrepreneurs on platforms to test the waters. That is, talk to the investors on those platforms about their idea and getting some feedback before they actually have to file with the SEC. So we're excited moving forward that we'll actually, have some additional changes that will be really beneficial for this whole new space.
Harold, I want to bring you in here for several reasons. One, I know you've said in the past that you noticed that in the aftermath of the financial crisis, there was a lot of tightening when it came to big bank lending. Also, recently, a couple of reports came out that talked about how minorities in DC fare. And one of the things that was super interesting was that minorities in DC seem to have equitable numbers of small business ownership, which is different than a lot of places in the country, but their businesses did not tend to do as well. They did not tend to last as long. And I think that speaks to what you were talking about before when it comes to access to capital up front and the ability to build and to grow. So I'm wondering how crowdfunding fits in your mind to some of the barriers that people see.
Interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I was at an event earlier today by Meyer Foundation and Consumer Health Foundation, and one of the things that they noted through data, there's a great report from the Urban Institute that talks about an equitable DC. And it really draws this picture really of kind of what we all know as a narrative and that we experience as a narrative, particularly for those of you who have been here for a while. I'm a native, so I kind of draw this line between having seen the city over the last 30, 40 years evolve and develop and seeing some of the exciting and wonderful things that are taking place right now. But there's still this narrative that's here, that's drawing a line, very stark racial lines. And it's interesting because some of the numbers that came out, and I might be making some of this up, but trying to remember off the top of my head, it was that black businesses particularly account for 9% of sales. And so when you look at some of the numbers and really begin to dig into the data narrative, not just what we experience as a qualitative narrative, so to say, there's some barriers there. And now we're actually putting data to the articulation of those barriers. So that leads us to actually now developing more specific solutions, right? Crowdfunding, I think, is a great option for expanding and making more robust the capital solutions that are available. But I don't know if that's for businesses and the business opportunities that we're looking at day in, day out here in DC and in this region, there has to be a broader conversation about removing barriers so that access to traditional capital is still available. Access to debt financing is still available. Not all businesses, and one of my challenges with looking at some of the focus on equity crowdfunding, right, is that not all businesses and not all business models fit into the equity crowdfunding model, which is not going to bring the returns that are necessary. So we have to think more robustly about not just this one funding source, which is new, which is exciting, which we should embrace because it's very much so needed. But we also can't take our eye off the ball on the old traditional sources. So for me, it's great, and I kind of deliberately not delve too deeply into some of the crowdfunding space because there's significant barriers that we're still knocking down so that businesses can access traditional means.
Karen, I want to come to you and talk a little bit more about crowdfunding, but also talk about some of the dangers or concerns. I think part of the issue with implementation was that people were really concerned that what you would get were a ton of unsophisticated investors who are either going to make poor choices or who were going to actually end up kind of harming the space by not knowing what they were investing in or not being able to kind of pony up the money for what they did invest in. Can you talk to me about some of the concerns that you have and if there are any ways that you see to get around them?
Well, I think the Jobs Act itself did a really good job at protecting investors. And, when we were talking to the SEC through this whole regulatory process, we're like, people leave tracks on the internet, so the whole, when you're crowdfunding, essentially, it's a very transparent, type of thing. But with respect to investor protections, look at if a non-accredited investor wants to, make an investment on one of these platforms, they go through an immediate test, that tells them, do you know this is probably the riskiest thing that you will ever do with your money? Yes, I understand. So there's those type of tests and that they have to take before they actually, invest in these deals. And I think, in terms of the other type of investment protections with regard to, the paperwork and the financials and everything else that needs to be disclosed, we're pretty good in that regard. And also, if you look at where we are in the market right now, there really hasn't been, even in the rewards and donation-based space over the past 5 to 8 years or so, this really has not been a problem. And where it was, the platform itself addressed it right away because they really care about their credibility in terms of being a safe place for people to make these donations. If I can address one thing on the regulatory side, though, you're right. I mean, we do have to look at all types of funding and see what the barriers are. I mean, particularly at the local level when you're talking about community banks and local banks. And what was heartening to see during the campaign is that you had both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, talking about the role of regulation, Dodd-Frank, and what it was doing to community banks, and really hurting their ability to make loans, and the fact that some community banks were going away. So that's another area that I see that there's some promise in the future in terms of fixing some of those regulations to again breathe some life into local and community banks.
Yeah, you mentioned that Indiegogo and the funds that you're able to raise through crowdfunding kind of helped you get that stepping stone so that more traditional institutions would take you seriously as a loan candidate. Is that kind of how you see it, as a stepping stone, or do you see it more so as an ongoing opportunity?
I think it depends on the business. For us, we raised $119,000 in that perk-based campaign in 2015, which was incredible injection of funds, but in the end was not even close to what we needed. So for us, it needed to be a stepping stone, but I think for other companies, that may be all you need, in which case you're able to entirely fund from that. But I think it's just for us, the more diverse our capital sources, the better. So it made sense.
So I want to come back to you two and talk a little bit about the incoming administration. As Margaret said in her introduction, we are going to see a changing of the guard in relatively short order. What do you think that changes about access to capital within the district and around the country? Do you think that it has any major impact on regulation or the way that banks or larger entities will loan?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to build on in 2017 from a lot of progress that's been made both on the policy front and in the market. I already talked about crowdfunding and what I see as some changes there that will make crowdfunding even a more viable tool for more entrepreneurs and small business owners. And certainly, when it comes to banking and community banks, I think, again, there's bipartisan agreement, and I certainly, with the incoming administration, the need to fix Dodd-Frank so it treats smaller banks more fairly, but also modernizes the entire financial regulatory framework. When you look at alternative financing and online platforms, I mean, that's another, source of capital now for entrepreneurs and small business owners. And so, rather than maybe taking a more harder line from a regulatory perspective on the whole fintech space, I think you're going to see sort of a lightening up, allowing that, space to develop a little bit. I mean, what's great there is that you do have, tools, for example, the Smart Box, which many online lenders are using right now, that allows small businesses standardized metrics to really discloses everything in terms of the cost of capital, hidden fees, all those types of things. So I'm really encouraged moving forward. And also there's a whole reforming of the tax system, which I think will be great for small business owners. I mean, the more resources that they have, both in terms of their profits and also money that they don't have to spend complying with the tax code if we make it simple, the more money that they have to put back into their businesses.
Harold, questions, concerns, hopes about the new administration?
I'm a local guy. And because we're talking about small business development and access to capital, I'll kind of stay in that space. I think the concern I would have that I'll express, certainly, the regulatory environment will impact all of our different states and things. So I'm not going to speak from that vantage point. I'm a recovering bureaucrat, having worked here locally in DC government. But I think when you think about what factors are important for the success of small business, we have to look at the ecosystem, right? The regulatory framework is certainly a part of that, and it drives that. But we also got to think about the resources that are available, and frankly, the commitments that are made and kept through an administration. When we think about, Wacif is a community development financial institution through the Department of Treasury, certified. And when you think about the resources that are actually available through that agency, as well as other federal government agencies, it'll be important to see what the commitments of the incoming administration is going to be. And frankly, how deliberate and how focused the administration is going to be on equity. Not equity from a capital standpoint, but we specifically talking about racial and gender equity, specifically as it relates to entrepreneurship and small business development, and putting budget priority where putting budget where priorities are. So for me, that's going to be some of the outlook that I'll be looking for coming into the next hopefully 4 years.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that we've been noticing, kind of as campaign points become actual potential policy points, is that, on the campaign trail, there may have been a conversation about entirely repealing a set of regulations, and then within the first few days post-election, maybe some of that rhetoric got toned down a little bit. I'm wondering, do you guys think that things like Dodd-Frank will be wholesale repealed, or where do you think we'll land when it comes to kind of easing some of the regulation that we saw ramp up in the days after the financial crisis?
I think it's going to be an interesting process for sure. I mean, when you're talking about some of these big 1,000+ page bills, some of them have been, mostly implemented, whether it's Dodd-Frank or the Affordable Care Act, aka, Obamacare. I mean, certainly, if you look at some of the bills that have passed the House in terms of replacement bills or a different, again, framework for regulating this space, I don't think it necessarily throws out a lot of these regulations. I think you're looking at sort of new regulatory frameworks where, where you don't have the community bankers, bashing the online lenders because they feel like, oh gosh, they don't have any type of regulation. So I think there is going to be, that type of balance. I mean, certainly there's going to be some regulations that will be repealed. There'll be a streamlining of regulations. I mean, we're looking a lot at the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. I mean, that's where we're spending a lot of our time. And that's one agency where we think there's bipartisan support for doing some wholesale changes over there because they just don't want to change in terms of streamlining the rules and regulation and the compliance in terms of dealing with a lot of the red tape over there. So you're right. There's what people say on the campaign trail, and then there's actually governing. But I do think there's going to be a lot of changes, and my guess though, it's going to have to be sort of a transitional thing because you can't just sort of blow something out without some type of replacement. So it's going to, I think from a financial regulatory perspective, that will probably take a little bit longer than perhaps maybe the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, for example.
I can note one area here, and I'm certainly interested in this this space, and you noted it a bit, Karen, as well, is thinking about the online lending environment,
Right.
and kind of separate from the traditional lending space, just thinking through what the framework will be or where Dodd-Frank will land and any revisions to it that will set a framework that allows for new business models to be created and capital to actually flow into businesses, but still protect our small businesses. And that's one of the challenges we have now. We're even seeing it with some of our borrowers directly. It's impacting our borrowers here in the region where folks are getting products where they either weren't made aware or they're being impacted by the business model that's in place by some of the online lenders. So it's this interesting dichotomy that hopefully is still addressed with whatever changes come down through Dodd-Frank.
So we do want to get to audience questions. If anyone has anything, I believe we have mics out in the audience. Anyone?
I would like to add from a regulatory perspective. I mean, the big thing that we're pushing from a regulatory perspective is to make sure that small business has a voice, a strong voice early on, in the process when they're actually devising and designing these regulations. And, there are agencies that do that very well. There are others that don't do it as well. But we think it's imperative that across all agencies, that when they're designing a rule regulation, that they need to bring in the impacted parties, including small businesses, to really get an understanding of the unintended consequences or the consequences of that proposed rule. It is good for small business, it's good for all business. So hopefully that will be one of the principles.
Did anyone have a question? If not, I absolutely have more questions that I could ask. No? Yeah, I had one. Yeah, I had a question for you, and that is, there are a lot of people that I know in the district who are now thinking about starting up their own businesses. This is pretty fresh in your mind. What advice would you give them? What resources should they look into? Who should they talk to?
I get this question a lot. It's hard to answer because, I think in this process of starting a business, for us at least, we could only see around the corners so far. Mm-hmm. And you have to be comfortable with some amount of the unknown, which is often harder for women than it is for men. And there's that whole thing, which we've definitely personally experienced. But I think, I was talking to a friend of a friend who was looking to run a crowdfunding campaign out in the West Coast last week, and she said, "I'm not sure I even need to do it. Do you think it's worth it?" And I said, well, if nothing else, it forces you to tell your story very quickly and sharpen your brand, which even if you don't need the capital, you need to do as a good business.
That's right.
And because we so early on ran the crowdfunding campaign, that really forced us to really distill down, no pun intended, what are we doing? Why are we different? So I think that's a big part. But and the district does have a bad rap in a lot of ways for being a place to open a business. I'll say we're maybe we're the exception. The distilling industry has been very supported by this mayor and previous mayors and councils in terms of setting a regulatory environment in DC that really allows us to grow. We are a federally regulated facility, so we can't get around that. But then at the state level, there's a lot of ability for your state government essentially to have an effect. So in DC, we're able to serve you a cocktail at our facility and a taste, and we're able to sell you a bottle, which is a huge difference. And so that really made for us made it a little easier.
Got it. Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much for coming up here and joining me in conversation. Audience, please join me in thanking our panelists.